Cory, thank you so much. I actually feel disrespectful saying it. Senator Cory Bernardi.
I've been called much worse.
You're just so easy to chat with. It feels familiar already.
And you are a great interviewer. What about that? The William F. Buckley of our time.
Wonderful. Thank you. More. Look, you touched on something that I think is vastly understated in Australian culture and psyche these days, and that is the fact that in the preamble to our Constitution, it acknowledges that we are a nation under Almighty God and seeking His blessing on our prosperity and providence. So that being in the Constitution and the nation having the foundation it does, what place do you see God actually having in the conversation around Australian politics?
This is a really important question, actually, because, faith is generally a very personal thing for people. And, whilst I may have a conversation with God, others will converse with, their deity of choice. But I think it is central to how we assess the intention of the framers of our Constitution, and it reflects our decision-making today. Their intent at the time was that this nation will be built upon the ethos of Christianity. That was the dominant consensus at the time. Now, let's accept the fact that not everyone's going to subscribe to that view, but it doesn't stop us from upholding that, because that was the intention upon which we should be placed. And you can't dismiss, under cultural relativity or anything else, that this has delivered us with this unique and amazing country, a country where people come here, embrace the values, work together harmoniously. We don't have, or historically haven't had, the great divides and the schisms that others have had, and whatever problems have emerged, we've worked through them. And the ethos of all of this is do unto, the golden rule, do unto others as you want them to do unto you. And I say that a lot.
I think it provides an intellectual honesty that we lay aside our own superiority and arrogance to use that word humble. We humbly rely on the blessings of Almighty God. We don't have all the answers. We actually need to consult with each other, discuss, debate, and search for truth together. Without this posturing and superiority that so often populates politics these days, and the media, where we're lecturing everybody instead of journeying together to advance Australia.
Dave, that's a great insight, and just as you were saying, and I'm thinking, you've really encapsulated what the mission of Australian conservatives is. That I don't personally have all the answers. I have, a perspective on how I see the world, and I have some ideas built around my own experience. But I also know that everyone has unique gifts and skills that they're going to bring into the Australian conservatives, and I can learn from them, just like I hope they can learn from me. And so you do need to have that conversation. And for a politician, or a political party, say, look, we don't have all the answers because we don't even know what the questions are going to be that are going to arise. We can only make judgment built around the framework upon which our party was founded. Just like, Australians can make a decision or go through a decision-making process built around the framework upon which our nation was founded. It's the same principle. How do you view the world? What are your parameters? What are your limits? Outside of the box in which you view the world, how far out of that are you prepared to venture before you get into radical experimentation? And those who don't have a worldview, or those who don't have limits, those who do not have something that is confining them in some way, shape or form, are going to fall for anything. And that is a recipe for disaster.
I think it's only possible to not acknowledge your worldview. I think everybody has a worldview.
Even if you're right, even if for an atheist, for example, has a worldview, a Green has a worldview. They typically have replaced maybe, the Christian framework.
It's just inherently dishonest, and therefore disabling to not acknowledge your worldview. If you start by this claim of objectivity as if you're some kind of superhuman outside the experience we all share, you're kidding yourself.
You're right, because we're a product of our upbringing and what's been, what we've taught at schools and so forth. The difference is, though, that if you're a Green or an atheist or an Islamist or anything else, you're not expected to suspend that in the public discourse. If you're a Christian, of course, you are. You're not allowed to advocate for, essentially Christian values. And there are many better Christians in this world than me. But I do not ever underestimate the importance of the Christian ethos in our nation today. And you do not have to be a person of faith, or particularly religious faith, to recognise that and, I think, support it. And so I say, even to people who aren't, obviously Christian, Australian Conservatives is the party that's best going to reflect your values.
Yeah, I probably equate the necessity for personal faith in a cultural context where faith is so important as the necessity to believe or even understand gravity. There are laws that just bless all of us. Whether you understand them and believe in them or not, they still apply to everyone. And so those Judeo-Christian ethics, so that civil society value that you're describing, is good for everybody, whether you believe in a deity or not.
That's exactly right. It is, and it's inherent in our laws. It's inherent in our personal relationships and our conduct. And where it's been discounted or dismissed or sought to be replaced, the experiment hasn't worked particularly well. And we see that in sections of the community now. We see it in, I think, in public life. The level of discourse and respect has diminished unbelievably so. I suspect it's because we've discounted some of the values that have been around and governing us for many centuries.
Now, shifting to the other major cultural influence in Australia, which is Islam, increasingly, if only by way of currency, it's just always in the news globally. I think it's important as we start this to differentiate between the ideology and the individuals. There's cultural Muslims, perhaps comprising the vast majority, who I have great friendships with and we have great discussions and debates. However, the set of ideas, when fundamentally adhered to, has been a really big problem for a lot of societies around the world historically. One of the things I'd probably like your political comment on is your understanding of the woven fabric that Sharia and Islam is. A lot of people in some kind of politically correct mothering statement try and suggest that there's a difference between Islam and Sharia, but they fail to understand that Sharia just means the way. It's as severable from Islam as Jesus is from Christianity. It's literally the very core and existence of it all. How does a Judeo-Christian culture keep that entire Sharia law system separate without diminishing the personal liberty of Muslim citizens?
It's another good question. I believe in freedom of religion because you can't have the thought police, and to deny one person the right to practice their religion in accordance with our laws, is a very dangerous thing to allow to happen. So, and you're quite right to differentiate between the individual Muslim who many of them practice their faith in a particular way, just like many Catholics will, or many, other Christian denominations will, without bothering anybody else. But Islam itself and the tenets of Islam is incompatible with, a democratic, Western culture. There is no separation of church and state. And I say to people in discussing this, just pretend for a minute that, Jesus wasn't the Son of God. He was just a guy walking around, in Israel. And Muhammad was just a guy walking around in, other parts of the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and stuff like that. Just compare and contrast their two lives. Jesus was always preaching about peace and love and forgiveness and turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and rendering unto God what is God. He sacrificed himself so that others could live. Now, that is the story. If you look at Muhammad had a period of time where, he was preaching tolerance and peace, but that didn't work for him. So he went off to Medina and started to preach hatred and conquering by the sword and a vastly different message. And that is the latter-day message of Islam. No one can deny that. Muhammad did marry a young girl. He did, conquer other tribes by the sword. He did sit and watch the Jews get beheaded. He did pass on the message about hatred of Jews and so on. You can't get through that. Yeah. And so if you contrast those two things, that's the ethos that's there. Now, aren't we fortunate? Aren't we fortunate that most Muslims don't have a fig for that history? They will revere Muhammad as a prophet, all good and well. They just want to pray and live a good, pious life. Just like most Christians, culturally Christians, may believe but might not practice, might not go to church every week. But one is central to our way of life, and the other one is an anathema to it, because you cannot subscribe to Sharia law and believe in the democratic principles that we have in this country.
So where the conflict happens is when we have a lot of Muslims in any given country. By the time the percentages reach 3 or 5% of a population, Sharia becomes very acceptable and very common. And the cultural disposition of those adherents becomes a bit more fundamental instead of nominal and purely cultural. And the frequent observation is those people who become what's labelled extremists were the people that you thought were your nice, loving, peaceful, democratic neighbour the day before. And it's often unforeseen. So my thought is the only way we can balance freedom and common sense is to actually just set a population quota that we really don't, wherever that may be. I could suggest an arbitrary number, but I think the principle is can we set an arbitrary number and say that this many is acceptable without an adverse impact on the cultural character of Australia. But
that brings into questions. So you say, okay, we're only going to allow a certain number of people of a particular religion into our country. I can't subscribe to that. And the reason I can't is it comes down to principle. Because if you can say, we're going to stop Muslims from coming to our country, what's to stop a subsequent government saying, well, we're not going to take any Jews or any Christians or any Hindus or anything else, I don't agree with that principle.
To answer that question, I'd say the premise or the precedent of merit, it's not an...
That's a different question.
It's not an arbitrary... We've identified a set of cultural values that is really negative influence in great numbers. You can't argue that about any other culture.
You could in some respects. Some will argue that about in various parts of the world that there's tribal conflicts and there's religious conflicts. I should probably
rephrase that. You couldn't argue that about any other ideology.
I guess
even then you probably
I guess in some respects what you're talking about though is prohibiting people from coming to our country built around a religious identity.
No, if I can take exception with your language there, I'd say the question is we're preferencing better.
So now you're talking about a process, and can we have better processes?
Prioritisation.
The answer is yes. But let me go back to this point. If under the system you say, okay, we've got enough Muslims in this country, what happens when someone like Anthony Mundine decides to convert and become a Muslim? All right? Does that mean, we just say, no, sorry, you're not allowed to do that, mate, we've got our quota or whatever? So there's got to be a freedom.
No, it would only be an immigration question.
So, and the question of immigration comes down to this. We have to protect our cultural, our social and our economic interest. Our economic interest is better served, particularly in the short term, by reducing the level of migration. we've got to protect our cultural interest, and that means we've got to start to think about the impact of the migration and where it's coming from. There are many people from the Middle East who are prohibited from coming here because they can't get visas, because it's controlled. The visa process can be controlled by, those whom are not supportive of them. You might see that in Egypt, for example, which is in Northern Africa, where the Copts can't get visas to come to Australia because the Muslim Brotherhood are controlling the visa lines and the queues that go into it.
So better processes for our immigration to prioritise
I think
the more compatible cultures.
You can look at education. You can look at who's going to come here, who's got the resources to do things. There are, I think, something like 95% of Afghanis who are here under refugee placements are still on welfare. Some 5 or 10 years later. That's not helping us. It's actually causing a problem, and it's causing a dislocation. So we have to be mindful of all of that. But I can never embrace this blanket sort of circumstance where, no, we're not going to allow these people in because of the colour of their skin or their belief or anything else. We want to make sure that it's working to our interest. You can do that by having a common language. And
I don't think dangerous ideologies are comparable to race priorities.
Well, apparently you're a racist if you think Islam's a problem.
Yeah.
Let's people get conflated about the two. Yeah. But yes, you can screen these things. But you said yourself, the very pious, compliant Muslim neighbour can become radicalised, and it happens because you've got a very small group of people who intimidate and browbeat. And we know, history demonstrates, a very, very small group of people can cause catastrophic consequences by forcing people into silence or compliance. And the greatest danger we have in this country is people being forced into compliance or silence about the issues. Yeah. We've seen it with child marriages. When we raised that many years ago, people said it wasn't happening here. It is. Female genital mutilation, we were told that was not happening here, and we had people excusing it. It is happening here, and it's barbaric and atrocious. Yeah. We've seen the multiple wives and polygamy happening here, that we were told that wasn't happening. The tyranny of silence in this space is outrageous, and if we do not fight against it in the sense of, in the public sphere, about advocating for what we believe and why other things are wrong, we will lose that battle. I'm not prepared to do that. 3
quick questions before I send you on your way. Payroll tax on a state level, will Australian Conservatives look seriously at reducing it, eliminating it, or even get rid of it? Fantastic. Quickly or over a couple of years?
Quickly. Look, we will have some announcements in that space, but clearly, you've got to be able to justify these things. We will make those justifications on a state-by-state basis.
What about income tax splitting for couples and families?
There's a couple of ways to build this cat. The issue is this. A dual income family where they both earn $50,000 a year pay about $10,000 less in tax than a single income family paying $100,000 a year. That's unfair. So we need to redress it. A couple of ways. You could income split, you could have a child-free threshold for children and spouses, those sorts of things. We will come to the best possible way of removing that inequality.
Final question. Which is the next minor party to come on board the Australian Conservatives and unite behind common sense lives here?
Look, I'm welcome. I would welcome anyone that shares our values that are coming forward, but unfortunately, I'm not going to disclose to you today, tomorrow's announcements, but it's not tomorrow. But look, we're open to working with anyone to get the best possible outcome. But I would say this, that the current impediments for minor parties, both electorally and also compliance-wise, means that it's very hard to sustain them. So there is strength in numbers, there's strength in unity, and Australian Conservatives wants to be that united voice.
Well, it's refreshing to see a politician who actually leads instead of following from the front, and appreciate the time you've invested in conversation with me today.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for your opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed that video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a look at this great video next, and check out the website for even more interesting articles and episodes later.